have a good natter. And then I remember that we're actually here for
the podcast.
Yes, yeah. And I forget sometimes. Hey, everyone, and welcome to the 10th series of Shade Podcast, exploring artist stories from concept to community. And today my guest is the artist Joy Gregory, who joined me in February this year to discuss the ways in which her process has developed throughout her practice from the 1980s to today.
Being able to have photographs of yourself and your family was like a really big thing. That notion of being able to work with people and people being part of my practice, I think started quite early on.
We also explore the themes covered in her forthcoming Heathrow Terminal 4 commission, which will be unveiled in June this year. Born in the UK to Jamaican parents, Joy's work explores the impact of colonialism on global perceptions of beauty, memory, botany, health, and traditional knowledge. And as a photographer, she's worked over decades in various media, including video, digital and analog photography, film installation, Victorian print processes, and more recently textiles, exploring photography as technology and as a mode of artistic expression. She's interested in understanding how individuals and communities remember and interpret their history, particularly in relation to their connection to the land. Her new major commission for the Whitechapel Gallery will open in the autumn of 2025, bringing together strands from the last 20 years of her practice. I hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Okay, let's dive in. Joy, welcome to Shade Podcast. It's so great to have you here. We've been chatting already this morning, but it's just a real delight to have you here. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And it's great to be able to share some of the things that we've been doing to build up towards the project and also how I've actually arrived at this space in terms of not just my education, but also my experience working community projects when I first left college.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And we're going to be talking about how these ideas evolve for the works and process, how process is informed by the ideas that you have and the work that you want to do. So we're going to start by going back to your earlier life as an artist. And you graduated from Manchester Polytechnic and the Royal College of Art. Before we go in to talk about your work a little bit further, can you give me a sense of the backdrop? Like, what was life like for you as a student in those environments, just starting to feel your way as an artist?
I think of Manchester, my attraction to Manchester, and I think probably for lots of people going to university, is that it was quite a long way from home. But also it was a city, it was really vibrant. And, it's like to be surrounded by lots of like-minded people who were interested in art, but also interested in going out. And I have to admit, I knew that it had a great nightlife in Manchester and still does, I hear, to this day. And also it was a bit cheaper than being in London, but also the freedom to be able to explore my ideas and to also be educated very roundedly in the course that I'd chosen to go on. So I chose to go to Manchester because I knew that they incorporated into the degree course. It was a degree course. There were very few degree courses in there. I think there were only 4 in photography across the whole country. It had a photo science element to it. And I was, I find it really difficult to choose between the arts and the sciences and the humanities. And the thing about photography is it ties all of those things together. So that was my interest there. And also, I think for me, Manchester, there was a lot of space for learning, but also allowed me to explore, I suppose, colour. So colour's been really, really important in my work, and it was essential in my work at that stage. So being able to photograph in colour, to explore colour and to paint, to continue painting and building things. So I like to do things with my hands. So that building those interiors and sort of like, getting people to pose in them, doing lots of still life, then made me think about not just the constructed interiors, because I was really interested in making construction, but also the lived experience of people in interiors. And I was living in a place called Hume, which is still there physically not as a space, but the buildings that I lived in have now gone, because we lived in the Crescents, which were quite notorious at the time for not being that safe. But I went round the Crescents and Bonsall Street in Hume and knocked on people's doors and asked if I could photograph their homes, which for me was really, really difficult because I'm I mean, I think essentially I'm a really, really shy person. I think at that stage when I was quite young, I was incredibly shy. I could barely even speak to anybody in my, in my environs, never mind to approach complete strangers. But I think I was more driven by understanding what people thought of as home. And I think that's something that has continued. And that might come from my background, where my parents, came from another country to make their home here in the UK. And so that idea of two homes. And I suppose also that you become culturally sort of bilingual or bicultural, because you shift very easily from one culture into another and one understanding of home into another. And I think that's been sort of like, maybe it was a very small thing while I was at Manchester, but it was something that was like a seed in my life, became a seed in my practice, which has continued to grow. And I think has really informed my work to present day.
That's so interesting. And we're talking about your process today from idea to installation. And I think that was a really important seed there of the interiors and the home. And I love this idea of shifting. As a biracial person, I totally understand that the cultural shift that you do between two cultures, two homes, but how that's represented by our interiors is such an interesting idea. And I've loved looking at the work that you sent through from the RCA and how your use of color. It was just so interesting. So what I'll do is when we share this episode, if I may, we'll share some images that you're happy for us to share of those works so the audience can have a look as well.
And also I think with the RCA thing, so the RCA I started doing, or continued doing the constructed interiors, and also began doing self-portraits without actually really meaning to do self-portraits. It was just that often I'd build these very complex constructions, and then the person who'd I'd asked to come and model would be, they'd got, the job in a cafe or something, and I'm really sort of being given an extra shift. And so it's like, there's me with my space. And so I ended up sort of like acting and being part of those spaces myself, then moving back out into real life interiors. And then I did it around the country. And my curiosity really then was about portraiture, and the idea of portraiture not being about the face, but about the space, because I felt that space has told a lot more about a person and their life and their interior space than just taking a photograph of their faces. So that was my interest there in continuing that exploration of home and how home tells you so much about each individual.
And at Manchester Polytechnic, you were creating these constructed sites, these setups for your images, and you were using multiple exposures and a plate camera. And then you took this way of working and this process to Sri Lanka. It was in 1986. You went on to take this residency in Sri Lanka at the Lunaganga estate. And there you photographed interiors and gardens on a much larger scale, sometimes using long exposures. I loved looking at those yesterday and reading that some of these exposures were like 30 minutes. Like, it's so interesting. They're absolutely beautiful images. And you collaborated with the people working on the estate, all as a way, as you say, of portraying the interior lives of the people that perhaps moved through the space or had lived in the space or who owned the space. Was it George Barra? Who owned the space?
Yeah, it was owned by Geoffrey Barr, who was an architect, who was an architect, but he's also a national treasure. And the space that I was in Lunaganga Estate was like his private country home. He died by then. I think he died just like maybe 1 or 2 years prior to me taking up residency, which was in 2003. And the estate operated as if he was still there and still alive. So everything continued as it did before, with people working on the estate and in the house and looking after the person who was in the house. And the year that I went, there was like big rains. And so the garden completely filled up with water. And so the lake, which is in the space, became this wonderful space of reflection. So, like when you're doing the residency, you have access to everything. And had access to these beautiful houses that are on the estate that different people used to stay in and when they came to visit Geoffrey Barr, but also to his own house that he had there, which is where I stayed. And the light there is very different to being here, but it's still a soft light. because of the rains and also the clouds that came over. Because it was the year after my father had died. And so I don't know, I spent the time there just reflecting on being in that space and the long exposures, which is something I had started doing when I was at Manchester, this learning how film works and how it works with these extremely long exposures, but also taking the plants and making photograms out of them, but also scans out of them. I took this small scanner with me. I mean, I was just using every aspect of photography. And it was also, at the cusp of when people were moving into digital technologies, but mainly working in analog. But also those long exposures, I think you could feel that the time is passing within the colours that come as the day and the light changes. It was just like a wonderful space to be. And then the collaboration, which I can see the connections between what I'm doing now and what I was doing in Sri Lanka was we had no common language on the estate. So I'm sat there speaking in English and they're speaking in the local language and they haven't had the privilege of great education. So I somehow managed to explain that I wanted to photograph people who are working on the estate in their favourite space around the estate and for them to photograph me in those spaces as well. Because we spent a lot of time together, them helping me out a lot of the time. I think the first week that I did it, they all came with their entire families to be photographed. So I photographed everybody's families. So I became the estate photographer. So it was it was not a really warming experience. And then, of course, once you photographed everyone, you had to go and produce the images. So I'd take a tuk-tuk into the nearest town to go and get them processed and then come back with all these pictures so people could then take them home to their families. Because we forget, now we've got our phones, everybody has access to their image. At that time, it feels like it actually wasn't out long ago. But yeah, 20 years ago, a lot of people didn't have access to their own image. And so being able to have photographs of yourselves and your family was a really big thing. So it was things you could then share with other people within the family and other relatives and also friends wherever you live. And I think that notion of being able to work with people and people being part of my practice, I think started quite early on.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you said earlier that you can see the connection between your practice then and how it's moving through now. And I wanted to think about your developing process. And you've explored people as represented by their interiors and their possessions. And now in your new commission for Heathrow Airport, you're working with asylum seekers displaced from their homes. And you're working with themes of food and plants and ideas of home as a means of telling their stories. I'd love to hear about the processes that you've used before that has proved useful for you in this project. And what new processes have you been considering for this Heathrow project?
The whole thing about food is it's the thing that connects us to where we are now, but also where we might have been before. It also connects us to our imagination and also to our sense of belonging. I think more so than borders or place, I think food, because it makes you think just not of home, but also of family and a safe place. So I wanted to focus on that in quite a big way, and also to the idea of plant in that big way, because I think everybody knows about plants, even though they might not be you might not think of them as this thing that's central to your life, but it's something we often take for granted. So even I, who can kill any plant on the planet, have plants in my home, and I always have plants outside. And I know sort of during lockdown, that became a really big thing for me, going on my little walks and coming back with plants I found on the ground and sort of thinking about the idea of air and breathing as being, because breath was something that was so important to all of us at that particular point, was the idea of these plants bringing out oxygen and that symbiotic relationship. With the present project, the focus on plants and food, it's sort of that commonality that we all have. For me, I remember I did this project around home with Ronan Mackenzie. In fact, it was Ronan Mackenzie's project around home that she set up in North London. And she invited people, artists of different generations to participate in that, but also making it a home in itself. And one of the things that she wanted to do as part of her publication was about sharing recipes. So I shared one of the recipes from my mum in the book, and I told my family about it, and they were outraged because, like, my mum's, grandma's recipes, they are, secret, and they're like family things. Never mind objects and other forms of inheritance and anything else. The real, core of inheritance is recipe. It was like an outrage. So what I did the following Christmas, because knowing I'd done wrong to the family, was I made a booklet of all the recipes that my mum had given to me. And I gave that, with pictures of the family inside as the thing that would appease them.
Oh, how beautiful, though.
So everybody's kept this, because every year I try and think of something to give to family, which is about family. And so I thought the thing that we could share with the workshops eventually was this thing around recipes and home and food. And so hopefully we'll be able to sort of like get people to talk about and share recipes and menus as a way of showing, again, new commonalities within the work. So I can imagine the work actually developing from out of those rich conversations that we will have during the workshop that are outside the idea of making and doing. Because I think with the idea of photography and learning, doing these lumen prints is just to provide a platform and a space where we can actually have those conversations. And I think that's something that I've learned through, like years of practice is to find a space. And that space needs to be something where everyone feels safe and everyone feels that they're informing each other about how to do things, but also things that we can share together that's sort of like a common land. So I'm hoping that what the work will develop out of those conversations.
Yeah. And in terms of the installation point, I'm thinking about idea to process, which are these wonderful workshops where you're talking and sharing ideas of home and safety and connection, to the installation process where those stories will be shared then with passers-by, with, people who are going home, they're traveling all over the world, and they will see these stories that you're sharing. And I just wonder what you have in mind for the final installation, if you're able to share elements of what you hope it to be, the final kind of image or set of images, and what you hope the impact of this process will be for yourself, for the people that took part in the workshop, and for the people who will be able to enjoy the work once it's up.
I mean, I don't know exactly what the images are going to be, but I never do. I mean, like I work in, I suppose, quite I don't know, sort of like a responsive way. So it's whatever things come out of that. And so it will be what comes out of those conversation, but also the images that come out of those experiences of us making together and sharing together. So maybe there will be some of the lumen prints in there. There'll be something in there that comes from the workshop, but it will also be about, the whole thing will really be around connection and how we're all connected. And I think the images reflect the different places around the world. I mean, and which is appropriate for an airport, really, because people are coming and going from different experiences and different places. And I think the idea of plants and food, and I think even poetry, are things that will actually connect us. And also working with the asylum seekers and the refugees, it will be, that they have come from all over the world from different experiences and for different reasons. So I think to bring sort of like something positive out of that experience is what I hope will be revealed in the final work and its installation.
That's a lovely thought to end the conversation on. This is all about connection, and I can't wait to see it. I'm not a frequent flyer, but I will be going to Heathrow Terminal 4 to view
You don't have to fly to go.
Exactly. So I really look forward to that. And thank you so much for sharing your process and your practice today. It's been a real pleasure, Joy. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure for me too. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I'm just popping back on to say thanks so much for listening to this episode with Joy Gregory. You can explore Joy's work further by following the links on her Instagram page, which you can find at joy_Gregory_studio, or by following the links in the podcast description. Joy's art on the Underground Commission at Heathrow Terminal 4 will be unveiled on June the 20th of this year. And in the autumn of next year, the Whitechapel Gallery will stage Joy's first monographic exhibition, surveying a 4-decade practice and featuring 100 works spanning analogue and digital photography, video, film installation, performance and textiles. I'll share the details of that show, of course, nearer the time. Subscribe to Shade Podcast to listen to all the episodes in this series. Also explore Shade Art Review on Substack, joining thousands of art-curious listeners like you who are discovering more about the work of visual artists from the Black diaspora. There you'll find art listings, comment, artist spotlights and guest posts, and free subscriptions are available. But for the full Shade Art Review experience, sign up today to receive 20% off your annual membership, an offer which is available for the duration of this series. This series of Shade Podcasts was produced and hosted by me, Lou Mensah, and mixed by Tess Davidson. See you next time.